From the Christ of the Covenants by O. Palmer Robertson, Chapter 11, Excursus, which structures Scripture, covenants or dispensations, beginning in page 201. Excursus, which structures Scripture, covenants or dispensations. God's initiatives in the establishment of covenantal relationships structure redemptive history. His sovereign interventions provide the essential framework for understanding the great biblical epochs. This perspective has characterized the present treatment of the biblical materials throughout. A major alternative for analyzing the structure of biblical history is offered by a school of evangelical thought, more popularly known as dispensationalism. Dispensationalism has set itself over against covenant theology as a means for grasping the architectonic structure of biblical revelation. As the dispensational perspective is being evaluated, it should not be forgotten that covenant theologians and dispensationalists stand side by side in affirming the essentials of Christian faith. Very often these two groups within Christendom stand alone in opposition in the inroads of modernism, neo-evangelicalism, and emotionalism. Covenant theologians and dispensationalists should hold in highest regard the scholarly and evangelical productivity of one another. It may be hoped that continuing interchange may be based on love and respect. More recently, dispensationalism has tended to minimize the significance of the dispensations as characterizing its distinctive system. Dispensationalists note that covenant theologians also make use of dispensational terminology. Yet the use of similar terminology does not involve inevitably agreement in principle. As a matter of fact, the concept of dispensations held by the dispensationalists set their perspective on biblical history over against the viewpoint maintained by the covenant theologian. Interestingly, the difference of approach in dispensational and covenantal history structuring manifests itself in two different systems appearing within dispensationalism itself. If covenant theologians make use of the term dispensation, so also do dispensationalists make frequent use of the term covenant. As a matter of fact, two alternative systems for structuring redemptive history function within dispensational thinking itself. One of these systems is covenantal, and the other dispensational. As interpretive remarks by dispensationalists regarding covenants and dispensations are compared, a significant tension emerges. It is as through the history of redemption had two structurings. At points, these two structurings interrelate closely with one another. At other times, they vie for prominence. It is not easy to determine which of these systems actually should be understood in the mind of the dispensationalist himself as the key to understanding the progress of redemptive history. The question presses forward. Which structures Scripture, covenants or dispensations? The present investigation will move through the various epochs of redemptive history by noting the optional perspectives afforded in covenantal theology and in dispensationalism. Because of the developing nature of dispensationalist thinking, more than one description of some epochs will have to be noted. Dispensational theologians have been quite active during the past few decades in refining their system of biblical analysis. Certainly it would not be fair to treat the dispensationalist today as though his modes of expression were identical to those which characterized the old Scofield Bibles as it first appeared in 1909. Yet at the same time, these early foundations cannot be ignored altogether, for the earlier dispensational theology continues to provide the basic mode of approach for dispensationalism today. At this point, one potential misunderstanding which should be dispelled might arise as a result of the arrangement of materials in the present synopsis of opinions. It should not be supposed that the old Scofield Bible, 1909, contained only a series of notes dealing with the dispensations and had nothing to say with respect to the covenants. Neither should it be supposed that the new Scofield Bible, 1967, contained only notes about the covenants and had nothing to say concerning dispensations. It is only because of a desire to contrast the treatment of dispensations and covenants in dispensational theology, while at the same time indicating something of the progression of thought in dispensationalism, that comments have been limited primarily to notes about the dispensations in the old Scofield Bible and to notes about the covenants in the new Scofield Bible. As this journey through the various structures of the history of redemption progresses, three matters should become evident. First, it should become clear that some significant refinements have developed in more recent expressions of the dispensational perspective. Second, it should become clear that a significant point of tension exists within dispensationalism itself as it views the covenants and the dispensations as two options for structuring redemptive history. Third, it should become clear that a basic difference of perspective exists between the structure of redemptive history as understood by the covenantal theologian and by the dispensationalist. Covenant theology understands God's relationship to man at creation from a covenantal perspective. Man's responsibility as created in God's image to form a culture glorifying to the Lord indicates something of the breadth of human responsibility established by creation. The whole of the universe was to be brought into the subjection to the glory of God. The ordinance of marriage and the institution of the Sabbath implied that man's obligation to his Maker extended to every area of human activity. At the same time, a special test of probation with respect to the non-eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil focused attention on man's specific responsibility to obey the word of the Lord simply because it was the Lord's word. By the establishment of this all-encompassing relationship, God bound himself to man, the creature. This relationship established by creation serves as the foundational basis for understanding the whole of human history as it develops from this point. The epoch that corresponds to the covenant of creation, according to the Old Scofield Bible, is called the dispensation of innocency. This dispensation is described as an absolute simple test, which ended in the judgment of the expulsion. This particular dispensation receives very little elaboration in the Old Scofield Bible. No explanation is given concerning the broad responsibilities of man created in God's image. Only the reference to the simple test describe the actual character of this relationship. Such an abbreviated perspective on man's responsibilities as created eventually must have a most significant effect on the overall view of the meaning of Christianity. More recent dispensationalist thinking on the dispensation of innocency may be found in C.C. Ryrie's Dispensationalism Today. Ryrie indicates that Adam's responsibilities involve maintaining the garden and not eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He notes man's broader responsibility with respect to the garden, although he does not elaborate on the significance of this obligation. He introduces into the discussion a significant feature at this early stage that characterizes his treatment of the dispensations. He attempts to provide scriptural limitations which bracket the particular epoch under discussion. In this case, he sets the limits of the dispensation of innocency as Genesis 1:28 through 3-6. As shall be seen subsequently, this effort to provide the points at which each dispensation begins and ends creates some troublesome problems for dispensational interpretation. A much fuller perspective on God's relationship to man at creation is found in the notes of the Scofield Reference Bible with respect to the covenant God established with man at creation. The New Scofield Bible capsules the substance of God's original covenant with man as follows. The first, or Edenic covenant, required the following responsibilities of Adam: to propagate the race and subdue the earth for man, and to have dominion over the animal creation, and to care for the garden and eat its fruits and herbs, and to abstain from eating of one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on penalty of death for disobedience. Except for failing to mention the role of the Sabbath in God's creation ordinances, this description of man's original relationship to Creator has much to commend it. It deals quite adequately with man's broader responsibilities, while at the same time indicating the specific tests under which man was placed at creation. In comparing the dispensational treatment of the first of the dispensations with the first of the covenants, it cannot be said that these two perspectives actually conflict with one another. However, man's original relationship to God finds a much fuller treatment under the dispensational analysis of the Edenic covenant than under the dispensationalist analysis of the dispensation of innocency.